Good evening, everybody. And welcome to Nietzsche 12:13, if you can believe that. Let me welcome also to springtime and the allergies and everything else. Let me begin with Cixous, but not with her reading of Clarice Lispector, not with her art of reading, rather with some letters from the prehistory, as she called them, letters from Manhattan. Cixous and this city of New York that, as she says, she loves without inhabitants. The dream of the dream city, she says, as if for a shooting, a filmic one, of course. In one of those letters, she has asked a friend to provide her with the address of a hotel where she stayed back in 1965. That's 52 years ago. The hotel does not exist anymore. Don't drive today with yesterday's map. Ce qui signifie, n'écrivez pas aujourd'hui avec une mémoire d'hier. On ne peut pas écrire hier aujourd'hui. And a bit further down, il n'y a pas d'hier à New York City. Il y avait aussi une librairie d'occasion qui sauvait tous les livres encore jamais lus, qui n'a plus d'hier aujourd'hui. Do not write today with a memory from yesterday. We cannot write yesterday today. There is no yesterday in New York City. There was also a second-hand bookstore that saved all the books still never read, that does not have yesterday anymore. Yesterday, or maybe today's-terday, I don't know how to translate this hier aujourd'hui, that cannot be summoned in the art of writing, in the challenge of writing. You cannot write today, she says, with yesterday's tale, le récit in caps. The tale has changed, the writing has changed, the time has changed. There is no going back. There is no history of literature. There is no tradition that can support the arts of reading or the arts of writing. Maybe all that evokes the foundational moments of the écriture féminine in her work, Le rire de la méduse, the laugh of the méduse. I shall speak about women's writing, about what it will do. A woman must write herself, must write about women and bring women to writing, from which they have been driven away as violently as from their bodies, for the same reasons, by the same law, with the same fatal goal. Woman must put herself into the text as into the world and into her own movement. The future must no longer be determined by the past. I do not deny that the effects of the past are still with us, but I refuse to strengthen them by repeating them, to confer upon them an irremovability, the equivalent of destiny, to confuse the biological and the cultural. Anticipation is imperative. Because one cannot write yesterday today, anticipation indeed is not just imperative, maybe also an imperative. What is the imperative of the écriture féminine? You may remember from Nietzsche 1:13 the conclusions drawn by Heidegger on Nietzsche's distinction between feminine and masculine reading, whereas the former engaged in interpretation and aesthetics of reception avant la lettre, the constitution of an unruly audience piecing the object of reading despite the order of the text. The second one focused on production, on the object itself and its internal characteristics, its natural order. Cixous shatters this distinction. Her building the feminine writing is a critical stance towards the possibility of a feminine aesthetics of reception. Indeed, her reading with Clarice Lispector, a project that is not only Cixous' but also Verena Conley's, theorizes this imperative of anticipation, this receptive character, a past, as in having received, of women reading and women writing by engaging in different, more creative, contemporary relations with the text. She begins by declaring so: either one is read by the text or one gets involved in its texture. The feminine reading does not abandon logic, but deploys a logic that she calls of improvisation. One of the efforts we make, she says, is to be transgrammatical, the way one could say transgressive. Transgrammatical reading crosses over languages and times. It is anticipation itself. Cixous' conceptual and critical capacity is astonishing. It is the matter of her writing. Writing and reading in Cixous are anticipation. They capture things before time. This is the etymology of anticipation. Before time confuses their culture with their biology. Capturing things before time has swallowed them. That's her critical and theoretical contribution, anticipating the language, transgressing the grammar, reestablishing the terms of interpretation beyond the models that have been inherited by both academics and critics. We are here at a turning point in our research, and we are happy to have with us three wonderful voices to delve into this turning point with Cixous. Patricia Williams is Patricia Williams. And in addition to that, she is a preeminent American legal scholar and the founder of critical race theory, a school of legal thought that emphasizes race as a fundamental determinant of the American legal system. Patricia Williams is currently the James L. Dorr Professor of Law at Columbia University, where she has taught since 1991. On March 1st, 2013, Columbia Law School Center for Gender and Sexuality Law honored her with a symposium featuring Anita Hill, Lani Guinier, and others. Prior to coming to Columbia, she worked as a consumer advocate in the Office of the City Attorney of Los Angeles, was a fellow in the School of Criticism and Theory at Dartmouth College, and served as associate professor at the University of Wisconsin Law School and its Department of Women's Studies. Patricia Williams has published widely in the areas of race, gender and law, and on other issues of legal theory and legal writing. Her books include The Alchemy of Race and Rights, The Rooster's Egg, and Seeing a Colorblind Future, The Paradox of Race. After a minute in which, you know, space will become time, as in Wagner, you know, Parsifal, so we will remove this, and then Verena Conley will intervene. Verena Conley is a professor of comparative literature and Romance languages and literatures at Harvard University. Among her major publications, we have books like Ecopolitics, The Environment in Post-Structuralist Thought, Rethinking Technologies, edited books on Helene Cixous, Writing the Feminine, another book on Helene Cixous, then Cixous Readings, The Poetics of Blanchot, Joyce, Kafka, Kleist, Lispector, and Tsvetaeva, Helene Cixous Reading with Clarice Lispector, and her creative work, The War Against the Beavers. Her most recent books include Spatial Ecologies, Urban Sites, State and World Space in French Cultural Theory, and Nancy Now, Jean-Luc Nancy. Our third presenter is Joseph Lawless, who is a JD candidate at Columbia Law School with research interests in critical legal theory, the digitalization of sexual and racial subjectivity, and the juridicalization of affect. He is the author of The Deceptive Fermata of HIV Criminalization Law, rereading the case of Tiger Mandingo through the juridico-affective, forthcoming in the Columbia Journal of Gender and Law, and Sex, Drugs, and Commercial Speech, the contested discourse of Truvada, forthcoming in the Common Law of the Columbia Journal for Law and Social Problems, as well as articles on Nietzsche, Heidegger, and Deleuze that we've been also happy to publish. He is also the co-author of an essay in the recently published anthology, The Oxford Handbook of U.S. Healthcare Law. Joseph will begin his PhD in the fall of 2017 at the College of William & Mary in the Department of American Studies. Joseph is currently working on a genealogy of the graphics interchange format image, known also as GIF. We have been fortunate enough to have Joseph in many of our classes during the last few years, and I am certain we are going to miss him dearly when he leaves Columbia. But we wish him our best and are at his disposition. Then my dear friend, co-convener, colleague, and everything else, and your specialist in criminal law, political scientist, and critical thinking, Bernard Harcourt, will conclude with some remarks. So, Patricia.
Thank you. I am quite anxious about being here. I'm certainly not a philosopher, and I've spent most of my career really thinking about very practical situations. And so I hope you will bear with me that I really approach this as having read and enjoyed Cixous over the course of my career, but its application is a big question for me. And so I came up with this title literally as I was sitting at midnight reading the chapter on the egg and the chicken, with a quite literal platter or splatter of scrambled eggs, and reading the part where she says an egg outside of its shell is not really an egg, so I could literally feel it disappear in my mouth. And that sense of the pull toward the literal is, I guess, my question to myself and my question to you. When I work with cases and controversies, and the work that I'm doing for the most part at this time involves looking at contracts around bodies, policies having to do with body parts, genetic patents, gene manipulations. So I want to be very careful here in the examples that I give, because certainly writing the feminine can't be about biology. It's about syntax and the control of the looking and whether or not one is located in the singular or plural, or the static or the motile, on top or repressed. So at the same time, my project is to test whether I comprehend Cixous' project. And I wanted to test it by exploring two examples that work against the grain of gender, either as biologically inflected embodiment or as normatively assigned matter of discourse. And so, again, I say all of this quite tentatively and framed as a question because this is so far outside of my field. But I'm, again, been thinking a lot about the movement of biotechnology to rewrite pregnancy in women's bodies as masculine, or what I understand is literally gendered as masculine. And I would also include the neuter as gender, and the inanimate as grammatical form of gender, and that the frequent inflection of women's eggs, wombs, bodies as devoid of vivacity may be a subtler form of that kind of gendering and of unwriting the feminine. And how do I just, yeah. Okay, so, you know, this is the Wikipedia generic image of a pregnant woman. It's called pregnant woman when you look down to see the sources. It is, when you look farther into the background of this photograph, the only thing you know that this is a woman taken at a welfare office, and that the author, as it's described, is a man named Ken. Now, this question, when I think about what Cixous calls grammatical gender, I'm referring specifically to instances where she talks about things like or she cites L'Inspecteur. On Sundays, the entire family went to the pier, she says on page 6. Sunday was always that immense night. And Cixous observes, we see that the originary night that engendered is masculine, and the immense night is feminine. I could translate it, she says, as the father who is the mother. And that's what I am trying to place my remarks in the context of, that kind of grammatical gender. We have to work on a certain syntax, says Cixous. We arrive at a system of objects from where we can go back to the subjects. She describes L'Inspecteur as continuing to open and close circles of life in style it is rendered through the ubiquitous gerunds and present participles. The question constantly raised, because there is no life without somebody to live it, is who lives? First, there are moments of gestation. During all the very moments of gestation, the subject is yet to come, and in the place of a subject, one has that which constitutes itself a pre-subject. So that's one part of my subject, of my topic. The second part of my questioning is in the context of this very vexed political moment where we have what is conventionally, or at least to this audience perhaps, a conventionally masculine-inflected discourse, literally a red meat-eating, He-Man-centric political conversation, those pictures emanating from the Oval Office, I mean the Oval Office, no less. And yet, I wonder if a lot of the appeal of populist discourse is its mesmerizing use of some of the fluid, generative, if not generous, grammar of feminine writing. And I don't mean that it flows as feminine writing, but that it is, or women's writing, that it is, but that it uses many of the figures of speech and literary devices, and that it is a kind of libidinal economy that is not precisely a gift economy, but that is powerfully affective, and to which ordinary political commentators have proved woefully unable to respond precisely because it's fluid and suggestive and disruptive and plays across time and tense and mood and is thus so suggestive that it's hypnotic, if you will. And in that regard, I'm still sort of captivated by this image of Donald Trump Jr., not Donald Trump Sr., but Donald Trump Jr.'s tweet of this. This image says it all. Let's end the politically correct agenda that doesn't put America first. If this conditional, if I had a bowl of Skittles and I told you, not if I were to tell you, but if I told you that just 3 would kill you, would you take a handful? That's, in the present tense, that's our Syrian refugee problem. And I want to come back to that as a sort of manipulation of an elimination of the conditional and the way in which Trump, I think not accidentally, repeatedly takes the conditional and puts it in the present, or takes it out of the conditional and eliminates it so that it becomes a sort of immediate. It becomes a sort of immediate and commanding present, and I'll come back to that. But this concern I have is what gives or what establishes value, as she asks on page 8. She describes it as a system, and I think of it as a system to which she refers of emotional and gestural delegations and mirroring and positioning and concentricities, what she calls the ruse of tenses, as well as a single plural system. So let me go back to the first example, the question of pregnancy in law. And so consider the case of a 47-year-old mother of 4, needing money, and I'm reading now from People magazine, sorry. But needing money, she hired herself out last year in 2016 to be a gestational carrier through an agency. Though she has never met the biological parents, she changed her mind during the course of her pregnancy and has sued the commissioning parties in order to keep the triplets she was carrying. A court in California has enforced the contract which she signed before implantation, whose terms require, as do most surrogate contracts, where they are legal, that she not develop any emotional bond. And based on this agreement, the judge terminated her custodial rights upon delivery of the babies to the intended parent. So, this case, actually, just to underscore some of the language, she hired herself out, or chose, to be a gestational carrier, so the language imports a certain distance from the biblical or the more poetic language of motherhood. She has never met the biological parents, and what that means, and this is, this is certainly something that my colleague Yasmin Ergas, who teaches at SIPA, talks about a great deal, that there is a difference between, to say that pregnancy, even where you have a donated sperm and donated egg, to call that non-biological, eliminates all of the parturition, it eliminates all of the hormonal interchange and so forth, and it reduces parenting to the gamete. In other words, it is almost an instantiation of saying that life begins at conception. It privileges, so that's one configuration, it privileges the gametic sense of parenting, but also that there is a life apart from the biological interchange of pregnancy itself. And she's written about this sort of configuration, which is generally, Yasmin, Professor Ergas, that is, and it's called a straight through, and as is my colleague Carol Sanger, but it's called a straight through theory of parental rights. right? It privileges, again, the genetic, not really a full biological connection, and it grants what many courts have called ownership, if not personhood or life, being figured at the beginning of conception. And it treats the womb or the woman attached to that womb as incidental, a kind of factory or production site. I'm quoting here, "We won't need women soon anyway. We can grow ears on the back of a mouse. Soon children will be gestated in labs. Stop romanticizing women's attachments." So it treats this woman's triplets as product and property passing through, just passing through. And parental rights in the bearer or gestator are terminated by private commission, rationalized by exchange value. So if an egg is therefore treated as a person for some purposes, it has been endowed by the same mechanisms by which we recognize a municipality or a university or a corporation as a person. So when Mike Pence invokes life in the extremely comprehensive way that he does, including not just fetuses or embryos, but the very thought of pregnancy as an immanent theological concept, I think of this as imaginary Citizens United. Now, contrast this to the competing theory, a kind of gradualist theory of pregnancy, not straight through, as though you dug a tunnel through the body, but in the context of adoption, or abortion for that matter, in which the decision to terminate rights is never final until after the birth, in recognition of the fact that bonding may in fact occur whether one signs a contract or not, and commissioning or intended parent is interrogated best not simply is based not simply on whether one is a party to the contract, but on metrics centered on a child's best interests. Similarly, abortion is rooted in a kind of discourse of women's choice, of women's will, of her prerogative, but also of freedom, autonomy, integrity of a whole body, and of notions of privacy, in which the gamete, or blastocyst, embryo, or fetus, none of them are persons, and most jurisdictions have not yet made fetuses full persons in the eyes of the law. Even so, the metonymy of womb is creeping up as a more and more frequent reference to the whole woman, and I think that that can signal a tendency to partialize, to reduce. Some wombs, particularly those of black, poor, and nasty women, are viewed as ungoverned and ungovernable, dangerous, fetus-devouring, baby-killing, even genocidal, contaminated, in need of regulation, purification, ultimate abstinence, or sterilization. Now, the case to which I referred, that I was reading from People magazine, actually was published under the title of Celebrity. And it actually, for whatever Wikipedia says is the generic pregnant woman, this is Melissa Cook. And Melissa Cook is described as a mom, surrogate mom. Suddenly the vocabulary has shifted. She's not really the gestational carrier. She's the mom who hasn't been allowed to see the triplets she gave birth to in February. Every day is hard, she says. I go through moments of crying. I try to force myself to think of something else, but I can't stop thinking about those babies and what's going to happen to them. So the 47-year-old mother, it was set into motion after she refused the biological father's demands to abort one of the babies she was carrying because he'd allegedly run out of cash. So again, this figuration of her as a contractor who's sort of like a straight-through container suddenly meets up with the idea that she's being forced to abort. That is to say, it's a violation of her autonomy, her autonomy and individual rights, which don't recognize a separation of the fetus. Now, the father of Melissa Cook's fetuses has stated that he believes singling out one child for adoption would be cruel, and thus he prefers to reduce. He has also cited health concerns for the developing fetuses. And under California law, the commissioning father, and here I'm quoting one of the agency's responses to this case, one of the surrogate agency's response to this case. Under California law, the commissioning father is the father, and there is no mother of the babies Cook is carrying. So if Cook doesn't abort, he still gets to decide what happens. He could adopt the third baby out elsewhere rather than allowing Melissa Cook to adopt him or her. And this spills into different territory, the question of whether or not the father should have to consent to be the parent of the unwanting child, even if he doesn't raise it. And it's cited, it's still his DNA. Should he be forced to have the baby out there any more than a woman should be forced to have her children? So these configurations bring very different kinds of questions. She is, there's more to the story. Ultimately, in February of last year, Cook gave birth to 3 baby boys and watched, quote, helplessly as hospital nurses whisked the infants away from her. She now believes that the father, a deaf, single, 55-year-old postal worker who lives with his elderly parents in Georgia, is unable to care for the infants. When they took the children away, they wouldn't tell her what gender, how much they weighed. I have been treated, she says, like I had no part in any of this. And so the question of having no part in this underscores the move in the vocabulary of both woman and the contents of her womb, however, for lack of a better word. We've moved from fruit of the womb, from gift and infinite potential, to a kind of language of altruism, sacrifice, charity, and then sometimes potlatch, just since the time of the Mary Beth Whitehead case. Increasingly, women have become reduced just to their wombs in non-agentic object carrying, incapacitated potential product, really judged by use value, and then we seem to be shifting more and more from use value into both the child and the womb as a kind of commodity exchange value. Again, a motion from mother-parent indivisible inviolability to surrogate mother, which is a substitution of metaphor, the as-if mother, to gestational carrier or service provider, sometimes referred to as third-party reproduction. Then my favorite cases always involve warehousing, fetal hotel, rental space, warming oven, which is not just metaphor, it's a metonymy, a part substitute for the whole. And then increasingly, particularly in the time of genetic manipulation, of a non-biological geography altogether, reducing any biology except the genetic. So, you know, this takes me again back to the question of, you know, of how the masculine and the feminine are written into this as a syntactical and gendered matter. And so, as I was reading Cixous, you know, I was reminded that in French the word for pregnant is enceinte, whose etymology implies an unfolding, an enclosing, or a surrounding wall. In French also the word for pregnancy in humans is la grossesse, a beginning, a sort of a beginning, a process, a quickening, an evolution of ripening, a fattening. And the word for pregnancy in animals, however, is la gestation, a word the dictionary defines as the carrying of an embryo or fetus inside viviparous animals. And viviparity is reproducing through live birth, or the development of the embryo inside the body of the parent. Non-viviparity is reproduction by laying eggs so that reproduction is completed by incubation outside the parental body, like a chicken or the way flies drop their eggs. And so in cases like Melissa Cook v. CM, is there a moving away from figurations of the ambiguous enfoldment of pregnancy as an unfolding, a processual evolution? Is there a gesturing away from figurations of our bodies as viviparous? Are we to be literally living the chicken? And I was reading another essay, not in reading Le Spectateur, but Cixous' essay, Vivre l'orange. I kept thinking it's you know, is living the orange, literally, but are we living the chicken? Is living the rooster masculine or feminine or both or something more? And by that, what I mean is, again, to go back to my concern that in English we don't really have genders outside of pronouns like he and she, or a few nouns like hen and rooster. actor and actress. But we do have subtler kinds of gender built into American English or British English or Australian English, cultural inflections of gender as a kind of semantic residue of cultural placement. And so I think it's hard to discuss something written in Latin or a Romance language translated into English without it being heard as somewhat essentialized. So forgive my digressing to make clear what I mean, because again, I am not a translator, and I defer entirely to my misunderstanding of Verena Conley's translations. But if I get this, if in French, Cixous puts writing the feminine in the context of the gender of particular words, so that questioning the question is feminine because la question ou la quête, these words are marked as feminine, and she plays around and around and around and around in concentric circles with that. But Cixous, she also says, she turns to l'inspecteur who writes in Portuguese, because she says it is good to work on foreign texts in order to displace our relation to grammar and to make an effort to be transgrammatical. And she says, I want to ask the question of the subject of enunciation, not that of the énoncé, of the statement. To be clear, she wants to question l'énonciation, which is feminine, but not l'énoncé, which is masculine. And that distinction, it seems to me, is a clarifying one, for it points to an underlying philological distinction, a distinction between masculine and feminine. And in Romance languages like French, Spanish, and Portuguese, in Latin derivatives, the general rule is that when a verb is used as a noun, it is almost always masculine. L'énoncé. The statement, it's masculine. But when a word is used as the result of executing a verb, it is usually feminine. L'énonciation, therefore, might not be understood as simply the edict or enunciation or a statement as we hear it in English, but more of an announcement or a pronouncement, a result of stating, a having engaged in the process of stating. And so my concern in all of this is that there is a kind of animation in that as well. And my concern is what gets animated and what doesn't, how things live in language, and how we objectify in a way that is ultimately translated into laws. So there are more kinds of genders than masculine or feminine or neuter, it seems to me, when I start to read it in this way. If masculine is, or if we think of gender as a type or an assortment, masculine, a verb used as a noun, feminine, a word used as the result of executing a verb, non-human, alive, or animated as animal, non-human, not alive, but inhabited perhaps by a soul, like the immortality of a corporate body, or perhaps, I'm not certain about this, the vivacity of water, recently given legal personhood in New Zealand. And then perhaps neuter, empty, entity, a thing, a non-entity, the non-egg. If gender is related to status and motility and motion, moreover, and vivacity, then it is also related to time, to order, to chronology, and to tense. And so I want to move to her discussion, or to the potential use for purposes of my understanding of the problems that I've set out, to her understanding at least, and again, I beg your feedback on this, because again, this is something that I pose as a question. But if the masculine is underwritten by a verb that functions as a noun, perhaps then it overlaps with the definition of a gerund. A gerund in English, an ing noun, sort of related to an infinitive, playing is pleasure, to play is pleasure. Then there's the gerundive, which does exist in Portuguese, I think, if not French. I believe it exists. And so the gerundive is a verb that functions as an adjective, bringing a kind of transitivity to the object that ends up in a formation that implies obligation, a mustness, and need. If the feminine is associated with the result of executing a verb, of having done something, a process of motion, then maybe the gerundive is implicated, even though we don't have it as a clearly decipherable matter in English. I don't know. But it's important, I think, because it's a construction of obligation, of mustness, of readiness, of ripeness, a to-be-doneness, a grammatical neediness that must be met and fed, a future participle that, while passive, drives a sense of the necessary, a mountain to be climbed, a message to be spread, propaganda, literally the feminine gerundive of propagare, that which must be, ought be, propagated, spread, or disseminated. So in English, we have a largely invisible gerundive, I think. Not something we think of as a feature of English grammar, but maybe a feature of invisibly genderized and racialized grammar. So again, to go back to the political discourse of the bowl of Skittles, for example, the imagined super predator poised for havoc wreaking, the lambs ready for slaughter, the Mexican prone to raping, the reflexively terrifying terrorist, to say nothing of the inflection of that bowl of Skittles to Trayvon Martin's Skittles. The migrant is one who exists in a forward motion of perpetual obligation to be quarantined, segregated, expelled, or exterminated, the command or necessity for activity against or about a grammatical object or purpose built into or folded back into the passive status of the noun or the nominal. He needs killing, cop-assisted suicide, the hidden gerundive as progressive and active, as suggesting a logic of resolution, a deus ex machina of deadly foreboding. So if gender, gerundives, infinitives point to obligation or tending to do something indicated, it also implicates a sense of time for the doing, whether in urgency or infinity. And this must-oughtness brings one to the question of mood. And for me, that goes back to the peculiar use of the almost subjunctive in that tweet, which indicates conditions. Subjunctive ordinarily would indicate contingency, subordinate to or subject not yet to facts but to possibility, a mood emotionally laden, subordinated to or overshadowed with doubt or desire. Eggs to be hatched thereby become the equivalent of chickens already, or chickens already sold for that matter. And I think it's a habit of diction, particularly in American diction, to turn the subjunctive into the present tense, or imbue it with truth through the use of tenses, to essentialize in the sense of making a hypothetical into a being in fact. It is or it did happen. And I think that's in part what goes on with political language and the American sense of possibility, what I call the wishful immediate. Mission accomplished, said George W. Bush. We are post-racial, many pundits said of Obama's election. I saw it on my Fox News feed, and therefore it is, as not merely suggestive of what might be, not merely contingent upon uncertainties, not at all subject to confirmation, but instead elevated to alt-fact, made into an is. It is fact, not opinion. It is not subjunctive. It is an irrefutably present thing. And that's actually, it seems to me, what contract law does. As Lewis Hyde lays out so beautifully in his essay on Marcel Mauss's notion of gift, it takes expectation interests and turns them into prospects that can be treated as present phenomena. It's the legal fiction that allows us to have credit in futures markets, and it works for objects gendered as inanimate. In fact, it renders its object inanimate. And it works well as a prompt for transactors to throw themselves into a future moment as though it were the present, to bring a wish, a desired outcome into fruition. It's why we call it the expectation theory of contract, a will theory. Desires are honored as palpable and worthy in the present tense. And American English, to a greater degree than English spoken elsewhere perhaps, and certainly to a greater degree than in Romance languages, has pretty much dropped the use of the subjunctive in ordinary parlance. If I were a carpenter has pretty much been replaced by if I was a carpenter, if I was a king or a master of the universe. There's no abeyance in any of that. And with its abandon by the collective culture, any shred of the contingency is gone. All things are possible, all things are present, all fantasies made real. You just didn't wish it were so. It was. The present imaginary rewrites the past. And this, I think, is symptomatic of a national mood that routinely considers itself only a purchase away from perfection, including perfectible babies. And the American work ethic that for so long promised anything as possible has morphed into a wish ethic that tolerates no earthly limit, a kind of greedy state of mind, and I worry it almost structures us to allow dissembling as a kind of blind ambition. Now, again, the subjunctive is not my direct concern in all of this. For me, it's a process of making conscious when and what we are doing when we conflate what we want and what actually is. Otherwise, when this conceptual conflation is exploited as a feature of political discourse, it serves to divide us from history, from facts, from sinkholes in the roads of life, and floats us gently into wonderland. So I think of this as a feature of political discourse, but front and center in our political discourse these days are women's bodies and their proper place, all of our bodies and their places, and how they should be disciplined. And these precepts, in turn, have been personified, given life, active voice, and personhood in the instance of artificial reproduction. You've got to get into a woman's body with a probe to see if there's a separate life in there in need of rescue. You have to show her pictures of her blastodermic vesicles in case she does not know. She is forced to look. Cixous asks, who in me puts me outside of myself, quoting Le Spectateur. And I wonder if that is not a way of, in this context of the work that I do, configuring pregnancy as a kind of masculine law. Similarly, an urgent mustness of discourse brought to the project of fear, Trumpian fear, written in Blood if not milk, in the Frisson, half pleasure, half peril, the Schadenfreude, Lacan's black hole, both death as well as orgasm, of the way in which he speaks. It might be a kind of writing the feminine. There is, if not writing the feminine in the sense of a gift economy, there is something female about its grammar and its attractiveness. Says Cixous, the text signifies massively it is an egg. There are 50 ways of entering this text, and it is up to the reader to find them. What counts is to find ourselves in the process. We have to work on a certain syntax. Oh, sorry, I didn't.
Already on. Here it is.
So, I'm not a lawyer. I am not a lawyer. So, I'm afraid I'm just a literary person of the garden variety. And so I'm going to be a little bit different here. Also, when we spoke, it was understood that this was on Cixous and Nietzsche plus Le Spectateur. And it was my understanding that you had read some of these things. Mm-hmm. Yeah? So why do I say that? It's because I am a very literal person, and so I took my assignment very literally, and I want to start by simply taking you down a notch. Thank you, Patricia. By being much simpler, and by, I wanted to contextualize Cixous and Nietzsche a little bit, because when I was asked to do this, I thought, Cixous and Nietzsche, first of all, this goes back to my youth. I mean, these seminars were given in 1980, when most of you weren't even born. Actually, interestingly, I took those seminars, so they're quite, it was going back. It was like going down memory lane for me. But you should also know that somebody like Lawless, for example, was giving these seminars on cinema at the time. And so, 1980. And so I think, I don't know how much you have worked already, and I come in from the outside. I'm sorry I came in lately. But I want to contextualize this, and I want to talk a little bit about Nietzsche and Cixous, and I want to talk about Nietzsche, Cixous, and Le Spectateur, and finally the law, and also about Nietzsche and Cixous today and Nietzsche today. So if you contextualize the focus on Nietzsche, first of all, in France, and I'm sure you did that, you know, that big colloquium in 1972, that was organized by Deleuze in great part. He was really the instigator of this focus on Nietzsche, also with Foucault, and Foucault reads him through Bataille, and then, you know, the Bataille comes through Nietzsche. And then Derrida... Now I know why you had these. Is that okay? It's better? So I think it's really important to see that, and also to remember something that Derrida said, and I had the quote. He says, he says that in 1972, for what we are speaking about at this moment, Nietzsche is for me a very important reference. So in other words, there is something that these people think about, and that is something that allows them to focus on Nietzsche, and Nietzsche becomes a reference. That doesn't mean that we cannot read Nietzsche other ways, but that is the way he kind of surfaces at that particular moment. And what are they thinking about? First of all, it comes out after the colloquium in a 2-volume these series. That was those were 2 very important texts. Everybody, it's a phone book. Everybody is in there. Foucault, Lyotard, I mean, all the intelligence. Cixous is not there, in fact. Cixous is not there, and that's interesting. But the 2-volume series is called Nietzsche aujourd'hui, Nietzsche today with a question mark. And I think that's very important to have the question mark there, because how do we read Nietzsche? And it's really in that context that Cixous reads Nietzsche, and at a time when it is possible to mix and match and go from Foucault to Deleuze to Derrida and back, which is perhaps no longer possible afterwards. But it is that way that she really is able to use Nietzsche, and her flirtation with Nietzsche is very brief. I had forgotten about your text, the Rire de la Méduse, and I think I really repress it, because if it appears on an exam one more time, so the Rire de la Méduse, but it's really in La Jeunesse, this unfortunate La Jeunesse that everybody sort of, you know, had very mixed reactions to. And it's one of the very few times that she actually openly comes and say, yes, she encourages women, and this is via Foucault and everybody. What does she get out of Nietzsche? She gets out of Nietzsche, first of all, the productive power. The productive power and the kind of the force of the body. And that's something actually very wonderful in Cixous, when she comes with this forceful of the body, and she really encourages everybody, and she encourages the students around her to be forceful in their bodies. And I think the other thing she gets around there, and that will bring us back to the law, is the question of the ressentiment. And so Cixous is somebody who is absolutely reads the genealogy. I think 113 was quoted already, and to go against ressentiment. There is no ressentiment for her. And so that really brings her into a certain type of affirmation where there is finally, and this is going to be important, and I should maybe find my text after a while, that where she disassembles in La Jeunesse, and I'm coming to my text here, it's better. She disassembles gender identity, urges women to write à la folle façon Nietzschean, in a really sort of mad Nietzschean way. And that's one of the few mentions of Nietzsche. Does this without any possibility of reversal, privileging metaphors, figures, writing forcefully. You know that, you have studied Nietzsche. And with, she combines Nietzsche with Marx and also with Freud and his libidinal economies. The expression is coined by Lyotard. She undoes all the fixed identities and praises uncertain, fluid, feminine beings, be they male or female, especially poets and writers like Kleist and Rimbaud. So borrowing from Nietzsche via Bataille, Derrida, she develops the notion of a general economy and general writing, and contends a restricted phallic economy based on reversals of intentions. She claims that identities are not essential. Like ID cards, identities are always bestowed from the outside, which is very different from now. I mean, it's kind of interesting to see that difference. So being as becoming fluidity, movement, crossing boundaries, affirmation, saying yes to life. I think that's one of the major points that I would like you to take away from Cixous, is that actually the privileging of life, which is not at all to say to disregard death, but to know and face the fact that there is life and death. And what is of interest here is the relation between the two, and always the focus that is very strongly on the question of the yes and the life. And there, I don't want to enter into the problem of women right now. It's too complicated. But we can say that, as Derrida will put it at the Cerisy conference dedicated to Cixous 30 years after the Nietzsche colloquium, that is in 2002, HC pour la vie, c'est-à-dire HC, for life, that is to say, how does she say it? In other words, you have to say that. How does she say it? Cixous doesn't adhere to a morality. Hers is sort of an ethos, a manner of being in the world for life, at least in La Jeunesse, in her Nietzschean period, if you like. She opts for a way less of being than becoming in the world. So then Nietzsche doesn't really resurface after 75. She occasionally makes a few remarks about him, and she says why women cannot engage with Nietzsche, remarks that are usually followed by laughter. In readings, and I trepidated when I opened this, but I went to the index and I noticed that the Nietzsche name occurs twice. So it's mentioned once in the first essay that I hope you read, the one before the law, and once in the last one. So the first one, it refers to Liz Spector, and she says that her writing, she has a way of writing. Through her writing, she exceeds to opposites in such a way that they cannot possibly be ever reversed, much more so than Nietzsche, because the Nietzsche quote, I forget, but what is it about, I do know when I say, I do know when I say yes or something. That's the famous quote that is in the, I'm the immoralist, I'm the annihilator. That's not her stuff. She operates at a different level, and at a level below that, that would be much closer to where maybe what you call it drives, you call it sensation, becomes a word. So what Derrida talks about at the time in his preoccupation with the law, or her preoccupation with the law, I should say, dates from the 1980s. So if you take Cixous in here, that first essay, which is on before the law comes in with the 1980s and corresponds also to the moment when many philosophers are working on the law. Lyotard on Kant and the moral law, when he gave conferences like this one, you know, he would pronounce it the moral law. And the first time I heard this, I said, what is this guy talking about? It took me about an hour to figure out, aha, it's the moral law. It was like a moral law? What am I in this moral law? Anyhow, so Lyotard is working on the moral law. Derrida is working on texte like le droit à la littérature and le lieu du droit à la littérature. And he talks about how literature, n'a pas le droit de raconter la survie, cet événement impossible, and how are we going to narrate this survie? So for him, it's always a question of narrating that which is not narratable. What Cixous does, however, is this, she takes him to task because she claims that this survie, this living on after death, that leaves effects of life for the reader. However, she is pour la vie, c'est-à-dire. So the relation between literature and law, droit for Derrida, deals with the right to say, to narrate that which cannot be told, the cryptic, the textual living on. Cixous approaches the question of the law, la loi, more openly in relation to writing and a primal scene, the scene of writing, that less structures then gives birth to la jeunesse, the subject in an ongoing manner. With Freud and Derrida, and unlike a Nietzsche and like Deleuze, for whom desire is part of an ongoing production, Cixous relates writing to a scene, to a theater, and the unconscious. Yet this unconscious in the text is an immense reservoir from which especially women are encouraged to write. The question for her then is, where does one write from? From the father, the mother, who speaks in you, what voices speak in us? And I once did, very, very long time ago, an interview with Derrida on this question of voices that's been reprinted in one of these volumes. So where does a writer speak from? Where does she or he write from? What makes her write? What is a scene of writing? Though she writes for life, HC pour la vie, c'est-à-dire, Cixous writes from death, that is, that of her father and now of her mother. I saw that she's coming here. Did I make a mistake? No, next week? No? I thought surfing, I saw Colombia and Cixous. No? Okay. And because she's going to give this summer a talk on her mother, and it's something is Max et Maurice, which is a children's book. So she has these wonderful ways of putting together, you know, to write from death, really, from the death of somebody, and to write toward life, which I think is quite remarkable. In addition, she claims that literature is always related to the scene of death and of a crime. What interests her, to repeat, is the relation between the terms. So it's life and death. She is looking for the emphasis the writer puts on the terms and their relation. Today, you know, would be Dostoevsky, who actually winds his way through everybody's reading with Nietzsche, Dostoevsky, Deleuze, Dostoevsky, Nietzsche, and that's a very interesting kind of chain. So the essays in reading with respect to Joyce, Kafka, etc., originally seminars at Paris 8, all part of a question, where does one write from? The first set of texts asks the question of writing, law, and gender. The other parts deal with the question of guilt and innocence, alienation, apprenticeship, poetry, passion, and history. In this first part, she reads texts and asks the question of the relation to the law in terms of gender. The response here is clear. The male writers, Joyce, Kafka, respect the law. Lispector does not. She does not, however, transgress the law. For her, according to Cixous, the law is but a word. And I would like to come back, that will be my second contribution, is to ask the question about the law and the word. In the story, Joanna, the protagonist, has access to her desire because, did you read the story? Did you read the Lispector story? No? Oh, shame on you. You have to go back and do your homework. It's a fabulous story, and it's just the greatest story. So this woman, this little girl, steals a book. And the horrible aunt, she's an orphan, et cetera, the horrible aunt says, what did you do? You stole the book. I have handouts, primitive handouts. I was making fun the other day of French people who had handouts, because I'm next to my pine press right now. Here, I have a handout, sorry. But what does she say when the aunt says, why did you steal? She said, only if you steal and you're frightened. It doesn't make me feel either happy or sad. So in other words, there are two things that go together. That is the fact never to work out of ressentiment and not to be frightened, not to be afraid. And I'll come back to that in just a few seconds. So she just takes it. And that is that the woman really, in a Nietzschean way, if you like, I mean, this is a very Nietzschean way, she has access to her desire. She does it because she wants to do it. She has, you know, this perfect desire. She doesn't have to be analyzed because it is really, she has that desire. And then contrast this with another girl, the girl of the horrible aunt, and the aunt says to the uncle, that's altogether different. Her aunt expostulated in triumph, Amanda, my daughter, even were she to steal, is one of us. And that, you know, Cixous likes that because Cixous constantly has these two couples, the ones who are above, not above the law, for whom the law is nothing. And you had couples across literature. You have the Kleist, you have in Shakespeare, you have, you know, you have Tancredi, Clorinda, you have Achille and Penthesilea, you have all these people who really are not part of sort of the common folks and who are law-abiding citizens. Yeah, and then the question is, the girl says at some point she's being questioned what is good and what is evil. And notice the slippage from good to good, bad, and evil, which is very Nietzschean. Good, evil. Evil is that which, she said, when is not to live. What is evil, she said? Evil is not to live. And that's really beautiful because you have life. So the evil, what is really evil? Not bad, because bad reverses itself, right, in Nietzschean terms, but evil. So evil is a slippage, and evil is when you cannot live. So the ant wants to repatriate the girl, to insert her into a system of good and evil. It does not work. The girl does not let herself be repressed or civilized. She lives, as the title indicates, near to the wild heart, as does the uncultured, or rather uncivilized part in her. She's not part of a philosophy of resentment. She simply follows her desire. Perto do coração selvagem, near to the wild heart, is that which is outside of culture. So that's why you have all these outdoor scenes, this beach, water, wild horse, always in movement. Culture is there to tame you, to bring you into a system of pre-established values, to restrict life. For Cixous, Lispector says yes to life. She narrates, however, and this is important too, she narrates small quotidian things that she elevates to epic dimensions. So the epic with the small is something that you find in a lot of the Cixous stories. For example, on the refugees, she has this wonderful play, the Dernier Caravansérail that she did with Mouchkine, which is all about these voices and their kind of, small quotidian details that are really elevated to epic dimensions. So, she narrates these small things. Lispector moves in a feminine space, both traditional feminine spaces and also those of a feminine economy. I shall not comment on this. Cixous bores this epic of the small and the infinite at the same time. Nietzsche is surface and flat, surface writing. Cixous shifts back to some more depth with Lispector. The epic quotidian dimensions are beyond any kind of reality or representation for her. And I have, how much time do I have? Do I have a little time? A few minutes? Can I just, 5 minutes? Okay, ample time. So here is something that is important for me and that I would like to ask you. She has these epiphanies, as some of the people say. I'm back to Lispector and to the girl here. The girl, Joanna, the one who stole the book, is now at school. And she is in a room with the other girls. And she dreams, so she thinks at night in her bed. And here is what she says. Look where madness leads one. Nevertheless, it is the truth. Does it matter that to all appearances I am still in the dormitory at this moment? The other girls fast asleep in their beds, their bodies quite still. What does it matter what it really is? Truly, I'm on my knees, naked as an animal beside the bed, my soul despairing as only the body of a virgin can despair. The bed gradually disappears, the walls of the room recede, collapse in ruins, and I'm in the world as free and light as a cold on the plain. So really interestingly, what does it matter what it really is, for me, that's interesting because that's where the text sort of takes off from representation and it goes into a totally different sphere. I wouldn't call it imaginary, but it really detaches itself from any kind of representation, and I shall come back to that in my conclusion as well. So for Joyce, then, as you have seen, the young man lets himself be repatriated. The eagles will come and pluck out your eyes with the refrain, he is enclosed in the system from where he writes, he's guilty. This produces life, but a restricted life based on guilt and death. His life is an effect of guilt and death. His guilt can reverse itself into innocence. Lispector's character, however, is not guilty, and her innocence is not reversible. She operates at another level altogether, and a much more powerful level even than Nietzsche for Cixous. For her, the law is but a word. From Derrida's doubling, then, Cixous develops the notion of a double innocence before any possibility of reversal. And by the way, she does the same with the fall and the biblical law, with the garden before the fall. The innocence is not reversible into guilt. It's Eve eats the fruit, and the fruit tastes good. So the church father tells a story that has to be retold. She claims, Cixous will claim, that her own origin is a garden. It's a paradise. And that's something that I'm working on right now, and so I didn't want to bring it in, but you know, she works on the Jardin d'Essai. The Jardin d'Essai is a colonial garden. I mean, it's an ultra-colonial garden, and no mention. Derrida misspells Jardin d'Essai, spells it with an S, and Jardin d'Essai is a test garden. It's put in place by the French, 1832. They arrive in 1830, 1832. This test garden comes in, you know, and they expand it, and she makes it into paradise. So this is real something. Can you never mention the colonial garden? So this is something that I have questions about, and I wonder how you detach that garden completely, entirely from history there. I mean, there is absolutely no reference. So maybe we can discuss that a little bit. This is the same as Joanna in her bedroom. You see, just kind of, what does it really matter? What is? Does it really matter? Perhaps not. So in Kafka, Before the Law, the man before the law waits to be able to get in. The door was there just for him. All he had to do was enter. There's no behind the law. There's no interiority. The man believes in a repressive frame that has been imposed. The law is but a word. It is not, as in Bataille, for example, a question of transgression. Transgression is probably part of Bataille's residual Catholicism. It is to recognize, Cixous doesn't recognize the law. It ignores symbolic law. That is something that restricts life and puts emphasis on death. So how about Nietzsche aujourd'hui? How about with a question mark? How about Nietzsche today? To quote Derrida, for what we are thinking about today, that is 50 years after their 1972 colloquium, 55 years, huh? 55 years. Can Nietzsche be an important reference to us? Deleuze says that things recur and that we can at least a possible dynamism from events at a certain moment. What dynamism event can we live from Nietzsche, and who, you know, Derrida was referencing him, and so how can we do it today? You know, what of difference today, what of thinking in the margins, of becoming minoritarian, of loss of identities, in a world that is much more focused on how to compose, how to be in common, on modes of existence that may not be purely linguistic, question mark. In an interview in 1996, Cixous reiterates her affirmation of life, that is her politics. Some of her texts, even in readings, focus more specifically on historical events, yet these texts, often the stuff of her plays, are not more political. She declares to be religiously atheistic. There is God, but God is writing. That is infinite. And of course she finds a similar thing in Lispector. You would find a similar thing. I don't have time to read it. As a writer, she is never political in a restricted sense. We have to assert life, to be on the side of life. And that's also where possibly we have to ask the question of how much we can go from one discourse to the other, and how much we can collapse discourses here, and what we do when we cross disciplines. However, she says, to be on the side of life, we cannot be afraid. And she puts it in the same interview, my worst fear, she says, this is a quote, is to be afraid. And so I was thinking, well, my worst fear is fear itself. And I said, who said that? It must be Nietzsche. No, it's FDR. It's FDR, and it's appropriated by Trump last summer. So I just shivered. Made me think of, so appropriated by Trump, horrible things. So what then are the Nietzschean themes in Cixous? She does not write with ressentiment. And then, of course, the animal in us, which we didn't discuss. But she moves from culture to wildness or innocence, if you'd like, with the reading of the Spectre, but also with her own writing in things like Cixous, Rêverie de la Femme Sauvage, again, both a place and a metaphor, nature, culture, civilization, perhaps not nature as much as we could juxtapose culture and civilization. Since she's very cultured, she's always on the side of literature and on the side of writing and literature. But laws of civilization, symbolic laws, those are very powerful laws. And I think one of your visitors, Etienne Balibar, recently, put that very nicely to show how we fight over symbolic laws. So the good and evil still works. The shift toward evil, and I think you have some interesting work coming out now by Rancière not long ago, who did a very nice analysis of The Departed by Clint Eastwood on the shift toward evil and how the evil is mythologizing and dehistoricizes. So these are things that are still important. And then we get to literature and the artist. Obviously, some of these texts heavily romanticize the artists, and when Cixous shifts her references from Nietzsche more to Heidegger, where she has so she spends a lot of time on Heidegger, things get a little complicated. I actually know that she quotes Heidegger as being one of her encounters, one of her literary encounters. I'm not sure, I didn't have time to go back to see if she actually lists Nietzsche as one of her encounters. I don't think so. I don't think she does. So Nietzsche is sort of a secondary source for her. But she expresses the fact that she has faith in literature. Je crois à la littérature. Deleuze says, I believe in the world, and she says, je crois à la littérature. It's an interesting contrast. So this is all modern literature, and she, that's another thing. I mean, all these texts are modern texts, and obviously a certain type of literature that lends itself really well to this. So she also mentions that she has recourse to literature as une consolation. Je me console en écrivant. Je me console en écrivant. So, the world is bad, so I write. And je me console en écrivant, I comfort myself writing. So she crosses over, perhaps like Nietzsche, by undoing these opposites, but more strongly, even below even the possibility of any kind of opposition. I would like to mention simply, to finish, that her écrire pensée, her writing thinking, is a writing out. There is no theory that comes first. The theory comes once you in the writing, in the act of writing itself. And she reduces the space between life and writing, not a writing where words come instead of life. So, some people love it, other people say this is not for me. But that's the project, and it's something that we have to discuss as well. So she also reduced the distance that separates feeling from words. And I had a quote, I don't have the time to read it, I have a quote, if you read that short text by Le Spectre, it's right in Le Spectre as well. So much more so than Nietzsche, whom she dismisses at times for being bombastic. Just throwing this out. Cixous writes close to Le Spectre, who for her writes close to life. like an Agua Viva, you know, all these texts. Always something general, something formless that is not reversible, and so something that is almost like water, and where the form just sort of barely emerges. Something that doesn't recognize the law as a word, that recognizes death but rides toward life, and that gives pleasure. And so I came across this very nice sentence as I was looking for this Jardin d'Essai, where she says, you know, how bad, how horrible the world is, there's violence, there's all these horrible events. And then she holds on to life by hearing the shuffle of her mother, who now died, but she has this 100-year-old mother and who shuffles around. And so the pleasure is in the morning when she gets up and she hears the shuffle of the mother. So this very tiny quotidian pleasure that, you know, makes it tolerable to live. So she writes on, perhaps not singing and dancing as in 75, though her new lecture on Max and Moritz in that's a children's book, and her mother should be interesting, as in 75, but with joy and with difficult joys. This time it comes from Kierkegaard and not from Nietzsche. So I think Patricia's probably not going to agree with this, but I think there is a message, and you know, she's a literary person, she's not a lawyer, and so there is a very nice message here to have joys nonetheless. Questions, maybe the law is but a word. That's sort of a difficult thing to answer. And the other question I have that I cannot resolve is the transformation of the real of a colonial garden into paradise without sort of any mention. So I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Just borrow your mic.
Good evening. Is this good? Can everyone hear? Okay, great. Good evening, and thank you for coming. Before I begin, I would like to momentarily digress from what brings us together to offer my thanks and gratitude to three very important persons, Professor Harcourt, Professor Velasco, and Professor Williams, all of whom have remained steadfast and faithful interlocutors during my time here at Columbia Law School. To have been asked by the three of them to sit alongside Professor Williams and Professor Conley this evening is an enormous privilege and a humbling honor, and what I may be able to add to this conversation will only be a reflection of their commitment in my growth as an aspiring scholar. As I was writing this, I was, of course, reminded of Nietzsche, who, after having placed on the mask of Thus Spoke Zarathustra over his own, he admonished his apostrophized disciples by stating that one repays a teacher badly if one always remains a pupil only. So my hope for this evening and for what is to come is to do this kind of Nietzschean justice to the scholarly legacy and the generous friendship you have offered me. So I thank you. I'm going to be speaking this evening about the gift, about what it has meant and what it might mean to be situated within the gift event, about the discourse of gift-giving that we see in the work of Helene Cixous, and about the queer potentiality that I locate within the gift. More specifically, my purpose will be to trouble what has been deemed so troubling about the gift, what Derrida characterizes as the conditions of possibility of the gift, that someone gives something to someone other, that designates simultaneously the conditions of the impossibility of the gift, that produce its annulment, its annihilation, the destruction of the gift. Derrida's treatment of the gift in given time endeavors to reconcile the paradox of gift-giving, that is, the annulment of the gift by the imperative restitution the very act of gift-giving engenders. The gift event, for Derrida, is inscribed within the logic of a circle, a figure without a discernible point of origin or point of conclusion, and thus a figure that is caught within the very circularity that's taken to constitute it. In short, the gift fails because of its inscription within the circle, for in the very act of giving, a logic of indebtedness is precipitated that relentlessly demands its discharge to comport with the persistent and what some might call agonizing coercion of self-perpetuating exchangist economies. Cixous seeks to re-theorize the gift against the imperializing weight of what she would call a masculine libidinal economy, whose law dictates the signification of the gift as the gift that takes. She's thus interested in, as she says, the why and how of the gift in the values that the gesture of giving affirms, causes to circulate. What we could say is a kind of feminine libidinal economy of gift-giving that privileges the ability of the subject to not need to return to oneself, to not need to settle, to be able to pour out, in contrast to the Hegelian dialectic, of which she is critical in The Newly Born Woman. I'd like to dwell in those moments when Cixous examines the radical possibility of the gift as generative of a counter-gesture that can disrupt certain economies of spending and retention and appropriation, although not the ones that she herself discusses. My hope is to work through Cixous' writing on the gift, to consider whether it is possible to cultivate an epistemology of gift-giving that resists the substitution of the gift with that which is always already oriented toward failure in the context of removing distance between the self and the other. To do so, I want to take up what I believe is one of the knottier aspects of the gift event, which even in Cixous' thinking threatens its realizability, the problematic of time. The intelligibility of the gift event is often bound to a temporalization of time, by which I mean the bracketing off of past and future as discursively differentiable derivatives of the present. There's probably two. Honestly, a discursive bracketing off past, future. I'm not sure what's that. I'm going to accept that that slip. Because the gift event is understood, just because I hang out with Professor Williams, who this is all we talk about. Because the gift event is understood to flow through a sequential linear temporality, and because the gift event's inscription within this temporality precipitates its failure, it is at this specific juncture, the juncture of the gift and of time, that I would like to situate my intervention. What I will examine here, albeit in provisional form, is a way we might think about reclaiming and furthering the potential of the gift by liberating it from the fatal consequence of temporalization. Such a maneuver would require positing the scene of the gift as one refusing to be, and unable to be, organized by the sequential temporality that divides past from present, present from future. Cixous' meditations on the gift, subtended by her extensive thinking on libidinal economies and the ongoing precarity of the relation between self and other, might allow us to envision an alternative kind of giving, one in which the self and other give and receive in temporal synchrony. The gift event so imagined offers an edifice on which to challenge the imperative of economy as loss, as appropriation, and as destruction. My hope is that we may be able to articulate the gift in a way that resists the imperative specifically of calculating value and thinking about risk as loss, to instead embrace the unknowable difference of the other without having to seek recourse and distance from the other. An exposition of Cixous' theory of the gift should begin with her critique of the gift as it is currently constituted, the gift that takes, that which reinscribes the desire to violently appropriate the other for the self. For Cixous, the gift that takes is an exemplar of an economic reality constructed by the law of the empire of the self-same, which she discusses in The Newly Born Woman, a paradigm whose philosophical underpinnings Cixous identifies in the Hegelian dialectic, that which framed the fundamental relationship between the self and the other in terms of the acquisition of property. Cixous suggests that the appropriative desire animating this dialectic, which causes the subject's going out into the other solely in order to come back and reaffirm and consolidate itself, cannot be held as inseparable from a long history of phallocentrism. The organization of history, which through the empire of the self-same is now thinkable through an appropriative economic logic, can be revealed as a dynamic drama whose coherence remains dependent on the distinction between the self-same, that which is mine, which I hold as good, and that which threatens the coherence of the self-same, that which is not me, and therefore I hold as bad. What limits the self-same is inscribed as a menace to its stability, which Cixous takes to be the other, that which is held as not the self. Within a phallocentric economic order, the other is taken as a sign of what may undo the coherence and continued existence of the self. As such, the desire to extinguish the other, which is for Cixous a narcissistic desire to consolidate the self, derives from fear. This is a fear of expropriation, of separation, of loss, a fear that Cixous describes as masculine. She states, "There is a relationship between the problematic of the not self-same, not mine, hence of desire and the urgency of reappropriation, and the constitution of a subjectivity that experiences itself only when it makes its law, its strength, and its mastery felt. And it can all be understood on the basis of masculinity, because this subjectivity is structured around a loss, which is not the case with femininity." And I choose this quote in particular because I actually don't find much of Cixous' writing to be essentializing, although that is a claim often levied against her. The concept of the libidinal economy, which is always qualified either through masculine or feminine and very often tethered then to woman or man, the female or male body, seems to reify that heterosexual matrix that Judith Butler talks about in one of the notes in Gender Trouble. But if we look at the way that Cixous actually uses these terms, they're not quite as tethered to the production of sexed bodies or the employment of a regulatory ideal that ensures a certain comportment of gendered identity. And so I actually find the libidinal economy and the way that she uses the terms masculine and feminine to be quite useful. The feminine libidinal economy, in contrast to the masculine, is a style of expenditure and non-return, admittedly, as Cixous said, in Cixous' opinion, more likely to be practiced by women. But what I find to be so important and what kind of drives this kind of economy is what sort of giving it makes possible. What does the feminine libidinal economy allow us to do in terms of what we may give? The kind of giving that this economy imagines is one that does not yearn for the violent appropriation of the other. Cixous charts an alternative affective space in which the act of giving will effract the figural circle to which the gift had long been bound through an elegant displacement of subjective atomism. As Professor Conley puts it in her text on Cixous, it is the, quote, question of the gift in relation to affective economies that has been a constant through Cixous' writings, all meditating on ways of loving. To love the other without keeping the other, without taking the other, and ultimately without extinguishing the difference of the other, to reproduce the fictive totality of the self. This is the commitment of the feminine libidinal economy, and this is the commitment that Cixous takes up in decentering herself as subject, and that she locates within the gift as a site of potential. In describing the gift in reference to the writings of Clarice Lispector, Cixous states that Lispector's works allow for the right distance between the self and other. That is a phrase she uses, right distance, such that the other may remain enigmatic and the self is not inclined or moved toward an appropriative gesture in this sort of in the libidinal space that she imagines and that she sees practiced in Lispector's texts. And I want to think a bit about this question of the right distance, what it means for the self and the other to be separated by the right distance. Cixous offers us an epistemology of the gift that will resist the centrifugal hegemony of giving and that doesn't necessarily require calculation of value or quantification of value. Cixous sees, however, that there is a limit to the efficacy of the paradigm that she proposes. She says, really, there is no free gift. And I am obviously inclined to agree with her. I can't imagine there to be some kind of transcendental form of giving outside of relations of power, but what I do want to ask is whether her insistence on the observation of distance is one that may actually be thwarting the efficacy of the gift paradigm. When we think about the right distance between the self and other, to me, when I think of distance, it necessarily invokes a temporality. The space between self and other in the act of gift exchange, the further I am apart, the longer it may take me to reach the other. This is thinking, of course, in an absolute distance, not in terms of the psychic distance, but the reason why I'm offering this kind of absolute or more material conception of distance, I'm going to explain in one second. And what I want to think about is should the idea of a right distance or a necessary distance be troubling to us? In an anthology that was recently published called No Tea, No Shade, it's a collection of incredible essays on Black queer studies, Marion Bailey wrote an essay entitled Black Gay Raw Sex, and he describes in the essay his enjoyment of condomless sex and seeks to theorize the possibility of Black queer male sexual desire for condomless sexual practice without the ascription of pathology. When he states that it is important for persons to avow their interest in this kind of sexual practice because of the characteristic ascription of pathology, he puts an endnote at the sentence, and I flipped and took a look, and there was just a little warning that said, but of course, be aware that maybe in your state you could be arrested for that, saying that out loud and practicing it. In 2015, Michael Johnson, a college student in Missouri, 23 years old, Black queer man, was sentenced to 30.5 years in prison for transmitting HIV to one of his sexual partners. He was not aware that he had seroconverted as positive. He found out afterward when he was arrested and incarcerated. And in Missouri, there is an HIV compulsory disclosure law. So I want to put these two statements in tension, Bailey's enthusiastic affirmation of avowing one's interest in condomless sexual practice and the result of Johnson's practice of it, and ask whether, in Bailey, when he looks away from the ascription of pathology, he's forced to leave the creation of a legal criminal regime to an endnote, and what the effect of that is. And I bring this up because I think the gift, as Cixous thinks about it, and as we might be able to push her theorization, could offer us a chance to imagine a form of sexual subjectivity that is not described through pathology, which is obviously Bailey's goal, but also doesn't depend through a putative erotics that calculates risk. Because this is what Bailey talks about, this is what Tim Dina talks about, David Halpern talks about, the signification of HIV as metonymic for queer male sexuality, the primacy that those two have. It's often a question of, well, persons who want to practice condomless sex, we cannot allow the ascription of pathology to be present here, or a far more psychologizing and problematic take on it. But every single time, this question of risk, of calculating risk, whether queer men are able to negotiate risk successfully, becomes part of the discourse. And I'm wondering whether the gift, especially as Cixous thinks about it, insofar as she encourages a gift that does not depend on value, that is not calculated, may allow us to move beyond a subjectivity of erotic risk calculation. Can the gift point us toward a kind of sexual possibility, a pleasure possibility, that might compromise the jurisprudence of HIV criminalization? And this brings me back to the question of distance, the right distance. When we talk about condom sex, we describe condom sex often as protected sex. The condom is a prophylactic, a barrier. For queer men, and especially for queer men of color, I'm inclined to ask, though, what is the signifying effect of this protection? What are we being protected from? Are we being protected from HIV? If HIV already stands to constitute the entirety of our subjectivity, though, is that what we are being protected from? Or are we being protected from a site of exchange, a site of skin-to-skin contact, the possibility of tethering each other to social and sexual worlds of viability and value? And this is where I think the idea of the right distance may fail. For skin to meet skin, for touch to be the consequence of a libidinal pulsion, which of course decreases distance in this absolute material sense, is what Cixous tells us in an interview, that the pulsion is what moves the subject toward toward an object of interest, subject of interest. The gift may not be about the right distance, but we may need to think about the gift as the right closeness, the right immediate proximity, the right physicality, what we might start to think about through l'écriture sensuelle. Thank you.
Thank you for those three papers, which I'd like to try to put in conversation with each other. And so I'm going to try and do that perhaps by focusing on two other elements that I find in Helene Cixous' writings, and maybe ask how they would relate or inflect or add to your arguments, all three of you. And those two other elements is going to be, first, something about the fluidity of our subjectivity, and so something about the way in which we ourselves can change and make choices about our subjectivity, about our identities, okay? And then second, a notion of kind of de-selfing that I see in Cixous' writing sometimes. So the idea of kind of moving away from a strong conception of the self. The idea in French of se dépendre de soi, right? To move away from one's own self. And so I'd be interested in trying to think through those two other dimensions in your readings to see how they interact with your readings. And so Patricia, the way I heard your argument was that there's something about how the uses of tenses, right, the uses of our tenses silently and covertly achieve a transformation or work some kind of a transformation on objects for us, creating new realities. And so it's changing the way we talk or think or conceive of, say, risk, in the example of the tweet on the Skittles, or how we talk about the body, a mother's body, for the changing in the way in which we think of a gestational carrier to a surrogate mother, and so the transformations in this being in part achieved through uses of tenses. Along the first dimension, though, it seems as if that's very much something that's being done to us, possibly, through the use of tenses. And what I want to explore, at least on the first dimension, is how we ourselves can fluidly change our own conceptions of self, at least. But I'm going to start backwards from Joseph Lawless's paper on gift and exchange. We'd seen a few sessions before on the session on Luz Irigaray. We had seen some first attempts to connect these questions to economies of exchange, right? And we had seen in her work kind of this provocative suggestion of a woman's exchange in a position in exchange economies, and the question of kind of use values and trade values. And of course, so Cixous pushes this further in her work and in the pieces that you were picking up on, Joseph, in particular, to circulate a different imagination of the gift. Now, in that context, it seems to me that Nietzsche actually is a foil. And rather than appearing as, Verena, you were suggesting, as this model, perhaps, of the façon folle Nietzschean d'écrire, Nietzsche appears here in this context primarily as a foil, and not so subtle foil, because Cixous explicitly singles out Nietzsche, it seems, and Derrida as paradigms of a masculine economy of the gift that she's trying to get beyond, it seems, in her writing. And so she specifically talks about, and she specifically kind of critiques Nietzsche's way of thinking about the gift. She says, woman is obviously not that woman Nietzsche dreamed of, who gives only in order to. Who could ever think of the gift as a gift that takes? Who else but man, precisely the one who would like to take everything? She drops a footnote there, right? And she drops a footnote specifically to Derrida at that point, and levels what is a pretty severe critique of styles, which we were talking about last times we were together, as something as it's a systematic reducing of woman to the place of seduction, etc. Right? Now, and elsewhere also in Castration and Decapitation, it seems as if Nietzsche is this idea, and Nietzsche and the idea of debt and the debt economy being a particular notion of exchange against which she's writing. Now, in that context, so in Alan Schrift's article, which he titles The Gynecology of Morals, gives a bit more charitable reading, I think, of a bit more charitable reading of Nietzsche in this context, insofar as he tries to unearth what he calls this feminine side of Nietzsche's economic discourse, which he associates with the kind of magnanimity of the person who is conscious of their power, the society that is conscious of their power, suggesting that maybe that is closer to the notion of giving that Cixous has. But it still seems to me very far, actually, from Cixous' sensibility, even on this more generous reading of Nietzsche. And so I thought that in that context, it might be useful to look at these other dimensions. So the first one then is the fluidity of our subjectivity, or something about becoming. All right, and that fits neatly, I think, with Verena, with your argument that Cixous is opting for a way of becoming. Okay, and surely I think we see that. Cixous describes her own fluidity in terms of her own biography, right? Born as French in Algeria in 1937, right? With a German, I think it was a grandmother. She talks about that aspect as well in her identity. Jewish, of course, in Algeria pre-war, living through the war there. Immersed also with her Arab friends and classmates. So this is in my Algériance in Stigmata, right, where she returns to her childhood in Oran at 54 Rue Philippe, where she grew up, which she calls a narrow, urinated street that led to the port through all sorts of insinuations. And it's there that we see her and hear her own fluidity moving through these identities, rejecting some, feeling none of them, confronted with her own privilege in relationship to the other school children, especially the Arab school children. She says, I only thought of leaving, escaping. In the meantime, I escaped without moving in books, above all the most universal one, those that spoke in our name, in the name of humanity. And she continues, this is how I explain today my non-attraction for French literature. The distance I kept from the authors I saw as being close to the court, my lack of taste, in spite of admiration for Racine, and my intuitive kinship with Montaigne. And of course, Montaigne seems to be an influence, an important influence, perhaps because of Montaigne's philosophical nominalism, perhaps. But she goes on, even the Enlightenment was too French for me, and I preferred the Anglo-Saxon penumbra. I left. the certainty I would never return, without regret. But it's that there are no grounds, without hoping to be able to return. Algeria of my foreboding, doomed to the violences that had been sown there. Enemy of women, I will never return, she writes. The end, right? But of course she does return, or Algeria somehow does return to her, she says, abroad, she says, in France. And then she concludes, my unexpected sisters and I give each other Algeria, and for the past we have the future without violence of which we dream together. And so these passages seem to have this element of becoming that I heard in your presentation, Verena, of shedding to identities, to returning to them, and the fluidity of subjectivity. And so it raises a question then about how we, in contrast to kind of the tenses that are the ruse of the tenses, how we are engaging as well in these kind of fluid practices of moving between the way in which we are seen, say. Now, the second dimension is this notion of a decentering or a de-selfing. And it's also something else that I noticed, this notion of se dépendre de soi, a loss of an ego focus. Now, when she writes about Clarice Lispector in Extreme Fidelity, she says, the greatest respect I have for any work whatsoever in the world is the respect I have for the work of Lispector. And why? She says, because her texts struggle against what she says, the movement of appropriation. For even when it seems most innocent, it is still strictly destructive. Pity is destructive. Badly thought out love is destructive. Ill-measured understanding is annihilating. She says her work, Lispector's work, is an immense book of respect, a book of the right distance, coming back to Joseph's intervention. And as she tells us at the time, this is Cixous writing, one can only attain the right distance through a relentless process of de-selfing, right? A relentless practice of de-egoization. The enemy, as far as she's concerned, is the blind self. And that's the self, that's just one element, and she emphasizes, and at the end she emphasizes, you know, we are in the end dust and atoms, right? And those are her words. And so perhaps more than the issue of difference is this question of de-selfing, erasing borders, perhaps, erasing difference, erasing oneself. Now, she's always playing with borders and trying to transcend them, it seems. In her discussion of Before the Law, I think it's pretty paradigmatic that she's trying to transcend borders, particularly where she has this discussion about how, in fact, he was not outside the law, he was inside the law, right? And so she kind of deconstructs this distinction between being outside the law, in front of the law, before the law, but also being inside. Thus, she says, thus, before and inside are the same, right? So she's always playing with this, trying to transcend these differences, but at the same time, wanting to somehow get beyond them, and the beyond, it seems to be related to some self-effacing of the ego. We are dust. We are atoms. And so those are two other dimensions that I think could maybe be a way to try to at least ask you to think about those dimensions and then to try and get the papers in conversation. Does anyone want to try?
Thank you, Professor. So one of the things that I was thinking about when you mentioned extreme fidelity, which is where I got the right distance line, is also in extreme fidelity, Cixous talks about story of Adam and Eve and the apple, and how Eve is disciplined for enjoying the inside of the apple, and what it means to enjoy the inside, and that the inside is desirable, and to take pleasure in the fact that one can move between what is outside and what is inside, and that in crossing that border there is pleasure. And that's where I see a lot of this idea of kind of the de-selfing question, looking beyond what is taken as an ossified border, either between subject and subject or within the subject psychically. I'm especially thinking about this as I was struck when I was reading Extreme Fidelity, because what interested me was the observation that Eve was being punished for the pleasure of the inside, which normally my immediate thought was, who would not be punished for enjoying the pleasure of the inside, for taking the inside, for tasting the inside, and that would, as I imagined it, would sort of be the paradigmatic act of heteromasculine sexual practice, the taking, the appropriation of the inside. But here Eve is enjoying it, and what it might mean to enjoy, to know that you can move into the inside, but not be in a position of historically determined power. That was something I thought was interesting.
I think that's very hard to answer. Just to, Cixous writes for she's 55 years or so. So in 55 years, you say a lot of things, first of all, and you don't always say the same thing. So it's like saying Freud, Freud has different periods and writes different things. So it doesn't have to echo the same thing all the time. So one of the perhaps I didn't make that clear, but since I was trying to put Nietzsche and Cixous together, I try to go back to the texts where there is actually this kind of fluidity that she celebrates in the post-60s. It clearly comes out of the 60s, and this kind of wild celebration of the 60s for a while that doesn't last really. And I think when she she sort of encounters Heidegger, things change quite a bit. But yeah, so that would be my first reaction. There are different. She says different things at different times, and also it's my own deformation. Perhaps I always try to link it back to some kind of history and some kind of a context out of which she writes. She doesn't write in a vacuum. You may think she sits in her apartment and writes in a vacuum, but not entirely, nonetheless. And so she, there are different periods, there are different contexts, there are different problems in the world. The world looks different. So the 60s, great, everything, world minoritarian, everything is exploding, it's going to be a different world. And then no. So then it changes. And so with the Algerian, since you brought that in, yeah, sure, but there's also, suddenly there's Algeria, and so you have to pronounce yourself on Algeria, but I can assure you that it wasn't always that way. But then suddenly it comes up, and so there it is. And, you would have to look very closely, but literature is literature, so we don't look too closely, but you'd have to look very closely, and I don't want to be disrespectful here of a writer, but, suddenly these Arab friends and this and that, really. So all this to say that the becoming that you were focusing on is, I think, a very fleeting moment, and then that sort of goes, and something else comes back. And the whole Heideggerian approach and the slowness of the approach, and it's very different. And I think I am not a spokesperson, but I bet we could say that right now she wouldn't believe in becoming. I think it would, it's a thing of the past for her. I've tried to, yeah. So I'll stop it there. But I thought that actually your paper was very interesting because precisely the question of the law, and since we're supposed to be speaking out of law school, I thought that was, you know, what you do with different levels of discourse, and how do you bring them together, and can you actually take a piece of literature and say, this is not the law, because, you know, here is the law. Do you have the right to narrate in this way? And so, can you say that the law is but a word, etc.? So I thought that there was a resonance here between what you were saying and what I was saying, and it opened up to a problem, in fact. And then I like your question of the gift, which is really very lovely. And there's this whole era. I'm too old because I've lived so long that I've gone through all this stuff, you know. The question of the gift, when that came up, it comes through Bataille and then Nietzsche, and, you know, and I remember Cixous saying that, you know, for her, for Derrida, there is no gift. Le don ne passe pas, but for her, ça passe, n'est-ce pas? And so the whole sort of undoing of the subject, and also the kind of mise en question of phenomenology at the time, that is not necessarily, that doesn't come back and comes in back in through the back door precisely. And then you have a different type of subjectivity, if you'd like, if you want to call it that. So.
Again, I'm struggling because I'm so much less familiar with this literature than if I had been trained in philosophy. But let me make a stab at Bernard's question about the question of tenses. I think that, you know, when I was trained in law school, I was literally trained within the first year in 5 different languages, which was contract, tort, criminal law, and constitutional law, and, you know, and it was on a sort of moral spectrum. And each of those discourses had a different relation to tenses and to time, and you see that in the remedial scheme. Contract is sort of not just immediate, but it's sort of cash on the barrelhead, but it also is very future-looking, and they even call the remedial scheme the expectation interest. And so it fixes the difference between what is and what should have been. So it sort of casts itself into an imagination of the future. Tort is somewhat more retrospective looking in the sense that it's about repair. It's the difference between what you have and what it takes to bring it up where it was, you know, how you sort of cast yourself back in time. Constitutional, and you keep going sort of down that moral scheme until you come constitutional law, which is this broad field that really does deploy a kind of epic time, I suppose. And one of the things that worries me about what we're doing right now is that we're almost moving into a kind of mythic time that is somewhat different in the sense that it is, and I think more dangerous because it is, you know, that's the appeal of certain brands of populism, is that it goes simply from a kind of epic beginning story, as Cixous would say, and becomes an original, you know, sort of the origin myth that is much more dangerous in some ways, and so, you know, the move from a language which you know protects certain expectations is an organization of tenses of time. It's future looking, and the move all the way to constitutional discourse, which is the language that constitutes us. Necessarily implies a longer time frame. It sort of appeals to an ideal that perhaps began in the past, but that will ultimately allow us to be together in the present moment, but also the future without stigma. It allows us to exist in our own. So for me, so we move from one to the other depending upon supposedly the circumstance. You know, and again, this is a very formal. You know, when I graduated from law school, these are very formal and distinct languages. I think what's happened that I find troubling now is that much of what used to be in the constitutional discourse, as part of constitutional language, has been pushed into the domain of contract. And so it is all about a very narrow kind of metric of cost-benefit as a mathematical kind of thing, but also as time and structure. So it eliminates the vertical sense of time, what else is going on in the world. Everything becomes a transaction cost that is not part of the discourse. And that's, to me, a kind of ordering of time. I also, Cixous also talks about the question of music and musicality as part of law. And it seems to me that that is, part of the fluidity of what we have done, both in terms of the way in which the push to neoliberalism in law school curricula has changed just within this very short period of time, a major shift in remedial and emphasis in curriculum and how we, how we look at things. But also just the ability to be nimble in terms of we've forgotten that we could speak another language, that we have this language as part of our jurisprudential, it's at hand with us. And so there's an immediate sense of blindness around the ability to manipulate time in this fashion. But, I mentioned in another seminar just last week that, in English again, but I think, again, to think about this as a general proposition, the overall project of law, the root of the word law is not Latin, it's actually Old Norse, it's sort of Old English, and it means a stroke, it means a beating, and so it's actually it's like the beating of a drum. And so it's an accretion of particular, and it's an accretion, it's a layering, it's like, putting layers on top of layers. And that sense of almost a symphonic project of law means that there is something musical about it. And so to some degree what's happened now is that we've gotten out of sync to some extent. And I do worry that the fluidity that you're referring to is being interfered with in a way that we've lost our sense of rhythm and of the musicality of what we have expected or what we've built this particular set of jurisprudential expectations on, and that if it continues in this direction, we will fall into rhythm. We'll fall into a different sense of how it should sound, of how it should, how the accretion should build. So I don't know if that's what
Let's come back to the question of time and of music, and perhaps also the question of becoming here, because I think that so there is another element to the argument, and to the argument you made from the beginning, in the way in which there is this manipulation of tenses that you were talking about, is that tenses are not really time, they are more like relative time. So a tense works in this way. The minute you construct the first sentence and you establish it in a given tense, then there is what the Latins call the consecutio temporum. So a whole universe of tenses that relate to the first one. In this sense, a tonality works when you write a musical, right? Yeah. So there is aesthetics of time there that works according to certain grammatical rules. And I was struck by this idea of transgrammaticality that Cixous talks about, and how in a certain way you can you must in a certain way funnel this fluidity and this transformation of subjectivity through this idea of transgrammaticality. And I agree that I don't know enough about, or nothing to be more precise, about the context of Cixous' writings and how she changed some ideas throughout time, but there is also a consecutio temporum in our reading of Cixous that calls for a certain transgrammaticality of her work that we need, perhaps we must, in a certain way, in order to be critical or to build our critical thought, to change the order of things as they have been given to us. So I think it's, again, I think that these ideas there of transgrammaticality, of fluidity, of transformation of the relations of the gift, etc., are extremely important. Just wanted to say that. Sorry. But and we have. I'm sorry. Sorry. What I wanted to say, as a matter of fact, is we still have time for some questions. So maybe you want to intervene and to say something like, did you just raise your hand? No? Aqua.
So this is more of, it's a question, but it's in the form of a pretty loose reflection. So Professor Williams, when you were talking about genetic over biological geography, I found that very interesting because thinking about the genetic as like a very specific localized instance within biology and biology as expanse, and then mapping that onto Earth being feminine in most Romance languages and terrain being like a specifically demarcated expanse. So it's kind of like the whole, if the womb can be demarcated and then like contained, then it can be masculinized, and then like that makes sense about its containment in the oven, right? But then I was thinking about that in terms of how biological knowledge kind of validates that kind of separation by saying that the fetus and the mother are actually two separate bodies that don't really interact. And so then you could draw it up into a contract and expect that the woman shouldn't develop a bond because she's just an incubator. But then there's this other biological fact I learned, that apparently women will carry fragments of DNA of the fetuses that they carry in their bloodstreams for the rest of their lives. So this idea of a neat demarcation like doesn't, like the womb is earth and the womb is in terrain. And then I was wondering about like how that pressures the idea of like the legal containment or metonymization of the womb. Like the biology is defying the genetic code of it.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think this entire vocabulary is still evolving to some degree, but I don't think it's what I did not mean to say that scientists have characterized this process as a biological division between the developing fetus or whatever, again, the vocabulary is so vexed, and the womb. In fact, the attempt to define pregnancy as a non-biological process really comes from lawyers and venture capitalists and those who do want to separate it for purposes of exploiting extractive, it's like mining, it's bioprospecting, it's extraction in a very, again, to use the image of the earth as female, it really is a kind of, it's like extractive, extracting oil or other things from the earth. And we have a vocabulary of making that, the consequences of that separable. But that's in the language, it's not actually as a biological phenomenon. And yes, the fragments of DNA and is just one description of the incredible interdependency and the sort of biological conversation that goes on between the inseparability of these processes.
Thank you. This is not actually a question. I just wanted to submit a small Freudian slip that I did when you were speaking that I think is relevant for the discussion. Because, no, I made while I was writing what you were saying, because you were talking about subject of the enunciation, and I wrote subject of the annunciation. And then I deleted this thing and I corrected myself, but then I thought that maybe this might be relevant. Not only thematically, now it's almost a platitude to state that Mary was a surrogate mother. This example has been made many times in recent years, but also in terms of grammar, because it is a huge theological problem to say who is the subject of the biblical episode, because according to Catholics, it's certainly Mary. Protestants, so-so. Luther is very ambiguous. He always says, I looked on Google, I'm not so cultivated, and in his sermons, Luther is always saying, yeah, Mary's amazing, she's without, the original sin, etc., but let's not forget about Christ. He's always saying this. And I thought, and I found a marvelous picture that I would like to show you, but my computer is too small. I'll describe it to you. And it's an Annunciation by Simone Martini in Florence, in which what is evident is that Mary is completely pissed off. And she doesn't want to get pregnant. This is obvious, because the text is ambiguous. And there's a difference between Matthew and Luke, and in Matthew, Mary is not there. It's simply Gabriel having, no, not Gabriel, Joseph having the dream. And according to some commentators, between Mary and the angel, there's a contract. According to others, he's ordering to her something, and according to others, and this is clearly what Simone Martini had in mind, the angel is bringing her a gift. But as you see in this picture, it's too small, I'm so sorry. She doesn't want this gift. She really doesn't want it. And the angel has this bossy attitude, typically Italian, I would say, bringing her to, yeah, you want this, you're going to have this. So this... Yeah.
Which is the symbol of conception. It's not the physical penetration.
At some point I'll find in my notes, I also wrote Annunciation, and I went through a long process of trying to figure out if, in fact, this translated as simply enunciation in English, or whether or not it was referred to announcement in a... No. It's interesting because when I was thinking of writing this, I wrote several. I'll show you my notes at some point. I'll find them because I'm not lying. I also wrote Annunciation. I wrote announcement. I wrote and I also thought of not Luke but Matthew. And I thought about this as an exchange of grace. I mean, because there's a lot about the exchange of grace, and how it's very interesting because I didn't know how to fit that in. But I'm glad that you brought that up. That's actually quite a lovely analogy. I love that. Pardon me? No. You talked about. Yeah, but it's not. No, this was my wondering about how it would translate as a legal matter, or whether it was masculine or feminine in that sense that I was struggling with. That's what I meant. And yeah.
I think it just makes me think of in Tim Dean's book Unlimited Intimacy, which is an ethnography of men who practice bareback sex in San Francisco. One of the interventions that he makes, ethnographic interventions, is what he calls documenting what is an identity, not just a behavioral practice, but a subcultural sexual identity, which are people who have condomless sex, and what a term that's sometimes used within a subgroup of this subcultural identity is persons who are gift givers and bug chasers, which is appropriating both the language of the bug as virus and then the virus as gift. And what I think is very interesting is that if you look at how Dean describes where he is doing his work in San Francisco, there's really not much discussion of the racialization of the subject that he's imagining, but it is clear that it's very unlikely that he is speaking about queer men of color, and so this subcultural identity is then ascribed to men who may not link together a certain practice, with this language of gift or not gift, which is another reason why I think it's useful to move, if we can think about queer male sexual practice in the absence of HIV as an absolute reason for doing something, not doing something. So.
I want to make sure that's on by.
So I'm primarily familiar with Helene Cixous as a writer for the theater, having been to a number of productions at the Théâtre du Soleil. And I bring this up because in Nietzsche, because Nietzsche also had some things to say about the theater. And my first impression, although I haven't really thought deeply about this, is that Helene Cixous' theatrical writing is in no way representative of what Nietzsche had to say about the theater, although maybe there are connections. Although I just checked this, that when the Théâtre du Soleil did the Les Atrides, which I think she had nothing to do with because that was written by Aeschylus, they were selling. They mentioned that they were selling copies of The Birth of Tragedy in the theater. The other thing, second observation, having read this The Laugh of the Medusa, as a writer for the theater, I see nothing of the kind of writing she was talking about in The Laugh of the Medusa in something like the text, the Tambour sur la digue or the Dernier Caravansérail. That's where she's talking about freedom in great exuberance. The texts have are very clearly marked by constraint, by reactions to constraint. They are an epic texts and very stylized, and the language is very stylized to a great extent. So that's the second observation. The third observation is that I don't know to what extent Helene Cixous is responsible for this, but the Théâtre du Soleil and the Cartoucherie are completely permeated by politics. So if she says that she's an apolitical writer, I find that hard to reconcile with my experience of that place. It's a rather extraordinary space in many respects, and I would even say that although the 60s are over, everywhere else, they survive. At least the spirit of the 60s survive. The principles of the 60s survive in the practices of the Théâtre du Soleil and in the organization of the space. In fact, it's which happens to have one of the most extraordinary kindergartens you'll find anywhere in France. That was my initial experience with the Cartoucherie beyond the theater. So those are a few observations. I don't know whether there are any comments about that. Sorry? Yeah. Sure.
And they all have wonderful kindergartens. I mean, I think, and yeah. So it's funny because one of my students wrote a thesis saying that Cixous went to hell when she met Mushkin, which I thought was a terrible idea. But anyhow, I don't think that the politics, it's always political. I mean, that was the point, whether you like it or not. I mean, you don't have to agree with it, but it's always political. Obviously, when she meets Mushkin, you know, there are certain precise topics and certain precise dates. But the thing is that all the texts are highly political, be it only through being transgrammatical. That's what is more political than being transgrammatical. You know, I mean, there are a lot of things I didn't talk about here. So that I'm in complete agreement with you, but I don't think that the politics, you know, of something like the Tambour sur la digue, for example, which is a wonderful, I mean, it was spectacular. It was really, spectacular is not a good word. It was really fabulous. Is heavy-hitting political in a kind of a socialist, realist sense, to be specific. So it is not that she is more political at some point, but she's always political. But also, I come back to, because I try to connect with what Patricia said, and I can connect it through the fact that, you know, I think she says over and over, whether you agree with it or not, but I too, she says, I can go down in the street and militate. But that's different from the writing, nonetheless. And I think this is something that you can debate, but that is the position. And so the writing, a certain type of writing, is always going to be political, regardless of whether it openly hammers it, you know, I shouldn't say that in context of Nietzsche, that's wrong. Yeah, okay. You're not satisfied with my answer, with my comment?
I'm not sure I should be satisfied or not.
But the encounter with Mushkin is an interesting one to begin with, because you have this incredible, forceful woman who meets another forceful woman, but is forceful in a very different way. I mean, you know, you've seen Mushkin, and it's, you know, it's a force de la nature, and so yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay.
Finally, would like to ask a question. Can we just? Thank you very much.
So I am not a reader of Cixous, other than a few texts. So I want to sort of ask a question of who is Cixous for us, and I think this is a question that Lawless, Joseph, you posed as well. But I want to ask this question by asking about it, or putting in play another kind of playlist, if I could. And it is a question about tense and time, and it's a question for Pat Williams. But I'm sort of thinking about the question of the body, the question of skin, which is the term that was brought up, and the right distance. But I also want to ask about the question of flesh. So if we think about someone like Du Bois or Horton Spillers, the argument there, which is the body made flesh, or Spillers, who writes about flesh. And so I want to kind of move to that kind of a space and ask, in what way does Cixous become important and or relevant for somebody who is engaging questions either of post-colonial feminist theory, or would ask the question, I think, that Bernard brought up, which is the question of the Arab and the Algerian in Cixous' kind of imaginary and in this world. And so I want to ask this question of tense by asking, I think the question that I have is, what is the tense of black life? What is the tense of Arab life? If we were to really think through the question of tense and temporality, and the question of the other, which you bring up, how would we really think through a kind of politics of the now through what we might take away from the Cixous? And I'm not very sure, or I want to pose this as a kind of provocation, but to really move with the question of expectation, of the past, of the retrospective, of the epic, the mythic. Where would we situate these other kinds of bodies in this world that we have presented to us today? And it is really a question of relevance for me. Why or how do we read Cixous now? Or why now? Or in what way?
Yeah, it is why I keep wanting to sort of apply it in very specific contexts, because, again, I'm struggling to some extent with this, and I appreciate that this was written at a different time in a different context, but so let me answer, if not directly in terms of what she has written, but what it provoked me to think of. So let me give you the example of the Jennifer Cramblett case. I don't know if you're familiar with that. This is a case of a woman who went to a sperm bank in Chicago, and she purchased what she thought was sperm number 380. And it turns out they mixed it up. And it turns out that she got sperm number 330, which was the sperm of an African American man. And she sued the sperm bank for wrongful birth of a child that was visibly African American. And that suit was in contract. I mean, and so the damages that she sued for were the value of her expectation, which included things like pain and suffering and emotional distress and the difficulty of raising this child in an all-white neighborhood, as she kept describing it, not quite all white now that this child is born, of the discomfort of trying to raise her and having to get her hair done. I mean, it was a perfectly ludicrous, I mean, from one perspective. But I think it's ludicrous because it was so much within the language of contract, and contract gives you a sense that's very, it's an immediate sense of expectation. It is, near future. And again, it discards all of the other longer-term life circumstances. And, the question for me is, what if this had been, if she had thought of this in terms of constitutional discourse? If this were not about, I paid for this sperm, I didn't get it, and here are the costs of getting a psychologist, that was also part of what she sued for, the cost of moving into a neighborhood where it's mixed so that she could raise this child in a healthy environment. But what if instead you reframed this in a constitutional discourse that began with the civil rights movement, that began with the fact that she lived in a neighborhood that was so segregated that there was, quote, all white, or that, as she put it, I couldn't expect, she said she was in a lesbian couple, and she said, it's hard enough for me to be in my family, which is homophobic and racist, but at least I could suppress it. But this child's difference is irrepressible, as she puts it. So to address that irrepressibility in the language of contract, it not only doesn't fit, it's violent. It costs this child her sense of self because it's so disconnected from the psyche or social position or stigmatizing of this child that she becomes an object. She becomes completely invisible. It de-animates her. It neuters her, or it objectifies her. She is the commodity in this, and in that sense, her fate is no part of the vocabulary of these responses. If she had placed this child as as the inheritor of Brown v. Board of Education, it would have been a very different kind of lawsuit. So that's, it seems to me, because, and that's not just saying it's a constitutional claim, it's also about the time frame and the geography over which one is looking. It considers the fact of what happens when this child, this case is 4 years, this child may be, soon she's going to be old enough to look herself up on Google. And so this is a social, it's a social consideration. And so that's, to me, some part of why I'm so obsessed with the grammatical rules of particular bodies of law, because I think it was invisible to her and to her lawyer, this styling of the language of contract as opposed to the language of constitutional law. And I think that that's the product of increasingly the product of a neoliberal moment. A lot of these bioengineered, perfectible babies, ART, artificial reproductive technology, and in vitro fertilization, are being heard exclusively as contract cases, which narrows the frame to an efficient time frame, an efficient or some tense of immediacy for purposes of, again, the extraction of profit.
Not to change registers once more, but you said, how can it speak to you? I think this is really something you have to find out for yourself. But wait a minute. The books are there because there are writings on Zohadrif, and And there are writings on Gandhi, and there are writings on Norodom Sihanouk, etc. There are writings on the refugees, Afghan refugees. Actually, I agree with you, mainly in the theater. So these texts are available. Whether they speak to you or not, it will depend on you, and whether she has to write to say these things, whether that translates somehow into something that you can receive. That you would have.
Though that was not, I think the way that was not the question that I had in mind. So it's not. I think the question then could be turned back around and said, why is it the presence of Gandhi that should make this receivable to me, or the presence of anybody else, right? So what is there within the very structuring of
within the very structuring? That's very complicated.
Worlds, right?
It's very complicated.
Just some final words before we.
I was going to say that I think
I'd love to hear from you.
an amazing question, and I'm thinking again about the idea of the right distance, specifically Horton Spiller's pornotroping, the sexually violent, the violently sexual, and when the self and other, if we continue to negotiate this distance as a right one, or even perhaps Professor Williams as an efficient distance between the self and other, I wonder if we're talking about a temporality of precarious life, how the valorization of the other as enigma and difference as that which cannot be transcended, if those terms that Cixous offers, even if they are not necessarily in political consonance with a contemporary mission, give us a discourse to think through that mission. And so that was my sort of immediate thought. We can see here's a space where we want to probably come to a different conclusion, but Cixous gives us a certain language, even though it would critique her project, to speak to this very pressing contemporary need of what to do for, or how to act with those who aren't, are not allowed to have their desire articulated, or who are not allowed to be desired, who suffer social disqualification across every register imaginable. So.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everybody. I am happy to have been here listening and thinking with you, and we thank you very much for your interventions. Now our time is up, and it's next time we will meet with Anupama Rao here. She will be leading us to talk about Ali Shariati and the global Nietzsche on April 27th, 2017. Please join me in thanking our presenters for their fantastic job.